All right, so today's appreciation watch is a Pierre Duval. Now, this is probably by the standards of the time, which would be the 1970s, a fashion watch. I don't know how that lines up with the reality of this, and I'm going to talk a bit about this watch in particular. But why is this watch important to me? You can pretty much ignore the buckle. This is an old Violox retro watch band. Violox was a watch company apparently. But this came with a leather strap. I just asked them if they'd throw that in. So I bought this at the Istanbul Grand Bazaar. First time I've ever visited Istanbul. Certainly won't be the last. I plan to actually live there for a period of time in the future. But my wife and I were visiting for the first time. We went to the Grand Bazaar. And if you've ever been to the Grand Bazaar or you heard anything about it, it is the watch clone, watch knockoff. Absolutely don't buy a watch there. It's an absurdity. Well, we had a guide throughout all of the historic parts of Old Town Istanbul, including the Grand Bazaar. And I told her I'd be interested in getting a watch, but I wouldn't, consider it for because of the way they have watches. And she said, I'll take care of you. And so she took me to the very far reaches, the dungeon, as you were, of the bazaar, to a woman-run shop, which I will tell you is quite rare there. Vintage antique only. Now, this watch isn't super interesting per se. In fact, at the time, I couldn't even really look up Pierre Duval. But I bought this watch because it has a story, and it was super unique, octagonal tonneau kind of shape to it with that dark to brown root beer coloring. Super simple dial. This is like a neo-futuristic 70s era. So it's a retro dial with that intentional neo-futuristic. And the movement in here is the hidden story that I learned later. So why is this watch important to me? Well, this is one of those instances where you go on a trip and you buy a watch to commemorate the event. That's super common. A lot of you do it. I do it. Or at least I've considered doing it. I've also talked about buying a watch after the fact that matches that experience, because when you see it, it may resonate a bit more, as like my Raketa 24 for Antarctica. That being said, this is a super interesting watch with an acrylic dial, so it can scratch real easy, but it can also be polished real easy. It's got this weirdly mirrored segmentation across the dial that causes that super dark presentation of the root beer at different angles, as well as this almost plastic, it may very well be plastic, indices on the where the 3 and 6 o'clock would be, the very large 12 and 6, as well as the hands. So it's this stark white contrast on this root beer. It does say Pierre Duval on there. Now, if you look up Pierre Duval, as I did, couldn't really find anything. But when I did a bit more digging, I found out that this is kind of a name stamp of a watch, right? Pierre Duval was not a watch manufacturer. These were made. But what is interesting is this has Laco history, Timex history, and eventually the ETA Swatch Group history. So it progresses the maker of the movement in this watch. So here's my SketchUp for today. Oh, yeah. So did I do okay? Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. It's a pretty simple watch, so we chucked it in there. And then obviously I've got my little spec sheet. But that was kind of fun because I learned more about the movement this morning than I have in the months since I bought the watch, which is the entire point of this exercise, is to appreciate my watches more. So I think I've already covered the specs essentially. So it is actually quite big for the era. It's 37, almost 39.5 with the crown. It's 10.4 thick, so it sits a little heavier, but when you put a bit thicker leather bracelet, think like a padded leather bracelet, it's going to rise up and kind of match that case a bit better. Obviously, you can kind of hear the tinkling of this. This is a very cheap bracelet, but it's a retro from a retro watch company, so it really actually suits it quite nice. Let's see. Crystal's obviously a beveled acrylic. The weight, incredibly light, as you can imagine. It is an automatic, so the movement is the lead here. So on this watch, it is a Durowe, D-U-R-O-E-W, Durowe 6921 movement in this watch, 17 jewel, and it says Incabloc right there on the dial. So 17 jewel Incabloc. Now, I had to look up what Incabloc was, but that was an old form of shock protection devised to keep the watch running after you've dropped the watch. So it's stamped right on the front. Like a lot of us watch people have feelings about when something says water resistant or automatic or any of that kind of named feature. I think outside of Swiss made, people get pretty opinionated about what it says. So this was super interesting because it's a technology, or at least a term, that's fallen out of vogue. So then it makes it an interesting dial and a bit of an education piece. At the time I got this watch, I did look up what that was, and I got some education on shock resistance and shock treatments in the watches and how they did it in the movements. That has left my brain, so I can't speak to that terribly well. But what I have learned more recently that I can speak to is the history of the Durowe 6921 movement. And the Durowe, I have to read my notes here because, and I'm going to mispronounce the crap out of this, so I apologize in advance. The Deutsche Uhrenruhige company that make the Durowe was an in-house company for Laco watches. And eventually they became, so strictly in-house, then they became a supplier for a bunch of other watch companies, and then they were eventually bought first by Timex, who only held on to them, I think, for like 6 years, and then they were bought back by the Swiss Eberhaus SA, Eberhaus SA, somebody knows what that is, but that's the ETA Swatch Group precursor for movements. So this is, whether that was a rolled up purchase to kind of consolidate stuff or whether this is actually a true precursor to ETA movements, I can't speak to that. What I can tell you is now when I see this watch, there's a lot more story there, not just the personal impact. And I know I overpaid for this watch because you can find something similar. I don't know that you can find this watch. I've only found similar watches on like birthwatch.com and whatever. So I have been able to hunt down like 2 Pierre Duvals. But here's the other cool story that we were told. Could be total crap, doesn't matter. It's a fun story, adds to the ambiance of the watch. So this woman had a collection of like 5 of these, each different in their style, all retro, all Pierre Duval, clearly part of a colored set that was designed in different shapes, like TV shape and oblong shape. And so kind of these neo, almost Jetson-like watches. And she had 5 of them. She said the original set was 7 or 9. I'm not 100% sure. But she said the owner of this set, the full set, and she has piecemeal sold these off, was the first AD of Rolex in Turkey. So the very first vendor who was allowed to legally sell Rolexes in Turkey, which is almost humorous at this point when you realize how many fake watches are sold in Turkey. But this person kept a full set of this release from Pierre Duval because he loved the aesthetic. He was obviously a much older gentleman, so this would have been maybe in his heyday of going out to parties and celebrating and wearing this kind of style aesthetic. But yeah, had the full set. And so she acquired it along with all of his collection, which she had long since sold off and made a ton of money on. But she kept the vintage because that's her love. That's what her store is, a vintage market store in the absolute bellows in the depths of the Istanbul Grand Bazaar. But that was a kind of a cool story. So ties to the history, at least in the sales and the people attached to this, and that they had the whole set. Now, for me, this watch also will continue to have value to wear to certain events. Now, I've mentioned, if you've watched any of my videos, I mentioned I live on a farm. I'm often doing dirty stuff. I'm walking the dogs. It rains here every afternoon. So this watch was supposed to be my wear all day watch and appreciate all day watch. And today, because it's dumping buckets and I had some more stuff to do that was a bit dirty, this has been half on, half off. So this will be I like to look at it. It reminds me of beautiful in my case, fun to see, fun to remember. And then I will wear this to like a 70s party. for sure. If I have the opportunity to go to a possibly 60, late 60s, but this is an early 70s party. So I will absolutely hang on to this watch. It now has such good emotional value, as well as some good stories behind it, some history, some real history, because of where the movement originated. And then ultimately, I'm going to have some fun with this watch. So I hope you have something in your collection that you appreciate, whether you bought it on a trip or you found out later it had a cooler story than maybe you thought, or you just bought a piece that you know you're going to wear to really infrequently but really fun events. Hope you're appreciating yours. I'm going to do that for a long time. Thank you.